Joining us now to discuss what are the legal and institutional shortcomings at the NPA that could impact on its ability to effectively prosecute is the former head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit at the NPA, Willie Hofmeyr. Good to have you with us tonight here on In Focus. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of having a task force specialized to talk about, rather to focus on the outcomes of the Zondo Commission. Do you think this will have any particular impact?
Good evening, and thanks for having me. I do think that the idea of a task force is a good one, because it's going to be very important for the people both from the NPA and the Hawks who have been working on these cases to be able to devote themselves exclusively to these cases and not to be bogged down in other old cases that they're dealing with and so on. So I think it is a very good development.
Now, the Commission itself, in some of its findings and conclusion, found that the NPA failed to prosecute state capture corruption cases in a monumental way. I mean, having been in the system itself, what do you think are the, firstly, institutional shortcomings that prevented the NPA before in successfully prosecuting corruption cases, and have those issues been addressed now?
I think we must bear in mind that, as other parts of the state, the NPA itself was captured. And I think that happened particularly with the appointment of Sean Abrams as the National Director of Public Prosecutions and the NPA head. And, you know, I think during his time, essentially no serious corruption cases were investigated at all. And, you know, I think the NPA was very much in the pocket of the executive at that time.
Yeah, and has there been any work done to address that institutional weakness?
I think there has been quite a lot of work done, but, you know, I think the NPA has also been, to some extent, hampered by budget cuts and shortages of resources. But there does seem to be some progress now in dealing with those issues. So I'm pretty hopeful that we will have better outcomes in the near future.
Yeah. There's some of, given some analysis, some looking at the NPA, saying, for example, there is a lack of training of investigators and prosecutors in matters such as forensic accounting. I mean, would you share that same sentiment?
Yes, I do think that there's a serious issue, and, you know, the reality is not too many corruption cases were prosecuted in the last decade, or serious ones at least. So there are not that many people with well-developed skills and experience in prosecuting corruption cases.
And how do you think that will impact, for example, on the type of cases that we are dealing with here? I mean, we're dealing with high-profile figures with support and skills from high-powered lawyers who are able to construct all sorts of lengthy delays in these particular matters.
No, I agree that that is a real challenge. But I think the Investigating Directorate under Hermione Cronje actually did bring in quite a lot of people from the private sector as well to help with the prosecutions and putting together dockets and the evidence against people. So I think a fair amount of progress has been made already, but obviously there is still quite a lot more that has to be done.
Yeah. And where do we begin? I mean, how do we begin to build capacity, in your view, at the NPA?
I think ultimately it probably has a lot to do with budget and resources, because there just isn't enough good prosecutors. There are good prosecutors in the NPA, but there just isn't enough of them with experience in dealing with really complicated corruption matters.
Yeah.
So I think that is where getting in extra resources from outside the NPA would be very useful.
So something like the offer that has, for example, been made by business and civil society to say they are willing to an extent to support the work of the NPA. However, the NPA has responded to that, saying they would want to insulate themselves from the perception of external influence. I mean, how do they navigate that particular aspect of things to say, okay, here's an offer that's been made. It could possibly enhance the work that we seek to do. But how do we ensure that then people don't look at us and have this perception that, well, you've got some people who are giving you money and therefore you are doing their work?
You know, I really think that is not a big issue for me. I think there are ways of dealing it. If business wants to make donations, it can make donations to the National Treasury, and National Treasury can then use what has become government money to assist the NPA. So I really don't think that should be a significant challenge. I think there are relatively easy solutions. And there's been good examples in the past of business and the NPA working quite closely together to tackle general crime and corruption. So bodies like Business Against Crime and others have existed for a long time. So, you know, it's a criticism that can be made, but I really don't think there's much substance in it.
Willie Hofmeyr stays on with us, and we'll continue in a moment. He is, of course, former head of the asset forfeiture unit at the NPA. Of course, we're talking here the capability, capacity, and otherwise, and shortcomings at the NPA. When we come back, we'll look at the legal shortcomings that could possibly hamper the NPA from carrying out these persecutions successfully. Do stay with us. In Focus continues in a moment. Welcome back live tonight on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405, with the former head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit at the NPA, Willie Hofmeyr. And we're talking, of course, some of the legal institutional shortcomings at the NPA that will have a strong impact on its effectiveness in prosecuting crimes of corruption. The NPA saying they are currently systematically reviewing the commission findings and recommendations with a view to investigate and build cases for criminal prosecution. Now, Willie, one would have thought in the 2 or so 3 years, I'm sure, I don't know, maybe it's 4, that the commission has been on, that the NPA would have been almost at a tandem already looking and reviewing and building up cases for possible prosecution. Why are they saying this is something that would only happen now?
Hello?
Yes.
Have I lost you?
No, we've got you, Willie. You can go for it.
Okay. Yeah. No, I do think, you know, ultimately a lot of the evidence that is being dealt with now comes from the Zondo Commission. So that's not necessarily evidence that the NPA has had before, although it may have been aware of it. And we must also bear in mind that for a significant time, the NPA itself was captured. And we had a national director in Sean Abrams who was very much part of the project to capture the state. So it's really only in the last couple of years that there's been possibility and a real move to start dealing with the state capture cases properly.
Now, some are looking at it and saying, well, we've watched the state capture over the years, and some feel there is a sense, I mean, that there is a lack of verifiable information that is coming out of the commission that could possibly help the NPA. From someone who's yourself coming from this particular system, what do you make of some of the testimony that came out of the commission? Is there something there that could be solid enough and guarantee a successful prosecution for the NPA?
I think that, you know, the evidence that comes from the Zondo Commission is compelling and very good evidence. Obviously, there has to be some processes to ensure that it complies with the requirements for a criminal case in court, but I really don't think that should be a major challenge. I think the biggest challenge will just be to put together a proper docket and to do the investigations properly so that the matter can then go to court. And as I say, I think a lot of the cases are fairly ready to go to court, but prosecutors will obviously want to look at those cases because they're the ones now have to, in some detail, because they're the ones who have to stand up in court and argue that case now. So they really have to familiarize themselves with all the evidence that there is, where the evidence came from, the sort of process kind of challenges that can be brought to the against the evidence that there is. So, it's not going to be just a quick, smooth process. I think that many of the prosecutions will be heavily contested by people who have a lot of money that they stole from us in the past.
Yeah. How about the complexity that is brought about? Because, these are quite high-profile figures with very complex ways of hiding money, and some of it was actually hidden in international bank accounts. What is the challenge here of obtaining international legal assistance, and how would we, what would be required to go about getting that kind of cooperation?
I think, Jen, there's a number of international instruments by the United Nations and other bodies that frankly compels people to share evidence. So when it comes to countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, most of Europe, there isn't really a problem to get evidence. But unfortunately, there are also a number of countries in the world who pride themselves almost on the fact that corrupt people can hide their money with them. And some of the Gulf states, for instance, are amongst those countries. So it's not always that easy to get the evidence back. And I think in some cases it's going to take quite a lot of pressure from the South African government and even international institutions to encourage those countries to cooperate.
By your own assessments, what are some of the specific obstacles that could possibly hamper the successful prosecution of this particular field of crime, which is corruption, most instances involving the state and some really powerful business people?
As I said, there's some complexity in international law, but generally there is a very strong United Nations Convention that compels member states of the UN to cooperate with each other in dealing with corruption, especially the sort of grand-scale corruption that we've had. But unfortunately, there are also countries that do not cooperate. And, I think the Guptas were particularly clever in choosing the right kind of countries to take their money to.
Yeah.
So it's not, I think it's recoverable, but it's not always going to be easy. And in particular, to get them back here, I think may be a big challenge. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it may be a challenge to actually get them extradited from where they are at the moment.
Yeah. And the degree of cooperation that amongst our own local law enforcement agencies that is required here for the successful prosecution of these cases. How intense do they need to work together here and collaborate, and what is the degree of information sharing that needs to happen?
I think generally inside South Africa there's very good cooperation between the National Prosecuting Authority and the Hawks. But I think both of those bodies were also infiltrated quite badly by, by bad appointments made by the president in senior positions. So I think a lot of that is being cleaned up at the moment, but the reality is still that we have quite a lot of people in law enforcement who shouldn't be there. And some, in fact, who were frankly appointed because they were corrupt and to try and protect the corrupt people. So, the challenges coming out of the state capture period is formidable, and we just shouldn't expect miracles to happen immediately. They may take a little longer.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit further about it. Do you still believe that the NPA, even the Hawks, are still infiltrated at the moment? There are still elements in there that that are still working against the institution?
There is indeed, and I think, nobody's been fired, frankly. There's a couple of people who were removed by the president who had the power to do so. But, the reality is that when I was still in law enforcement, we still didn't quite know who we could trust and who we can't trust. And that's something you can only work out in the process of working with people. But one of the things that I'm a big fan of is that the Special Investigating Unit has a very sophisticated integrity testing process. And I really think that we should be using that a lot more in South Africa to get an idea of what the integrity level is of the different role players that we have to work with in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
So I think there are solutions, but they have to be implemented by somebody.
All in all, I mean, if we sit and look today at what's coming out and what will come out in Chapter 2, in Chapter 3 of this report, can we be confident that some degree of prosecutions will be done here successfully? Of course, bearing in mind that there are limited resources currently that are available in the country.
No, I'm confident that there will be prosecutions, but we must also just remember that generally the economic crime cases take quite a long time to prosecute, because the criminals in those cases have the option of waiting to see exactly what the case of the state is, and then they can try and manufacture a defense that evades all the evidence or tries to evade the evidence that the state has. But that is something we've had to live with for many years in our country already, that our system is not really optimal for dealing with white-collar crime.
Willie Hofmeyr, I appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Former head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit at the NPA there, Willie Hofmeyr.